Hey, momentary blip, but we are back. I'm Arun Chaudhry, and I'm here talking about filming the police alongside Lee, who's an attorney for the ACLU.
Howdy.
And you were in the middle of explaining to us that we are seeing more and more videotapes of incidents of the police, especially with the killing of black men, and we've seen, we could rattle off 7 or 9 incidents, and all the way from a simple picture to a live stream video, and we're seeing a lot of this material. But the million-dollar question is, how close can you be? And you were saying this is more alchemy than science.
That's right, and maybe a big picture point that probably applies to everything we say today is, I'm a lawyer, you've been out in the streets videotaping. Sometimes there's a disconnect between what your constitutional rights are and how they may shake out on the ground, right? So a good rule of thumb is be armed with your rights, know your rights, but understand that if you're in a high pressure situation where there's a lot of incentive for the police to say, stop you from videotaping, that knowing your rights is just one tool in your toolkit, right? Also remaining calm.
Yes, I was going to say, how you articulate your rights.
Being polite, never lying to the police. So there are a lot of practical bits of advice that go along with the legal. But to really try and answer your question about how far away is the right amount away, the sad answer is there's not a number I can give you. And actually there have been some states that have tried to pass this is called obstructing officers in their jobs, have tried to pass obstruction statutes that have a number on it. And interestingly, it's been community activists who have pushed back against that because they've had situations where they believe the police have wrongly said, oh, you're 9 feet away. And they're saying, no, I'm 11, right? And it creates these factual arguments that nobody needs to be having with a cop during, a heightened situation. So here's the real rule. You cannot interfere with an arrest. And usually when we think of interference, we think physical, right? So obviously, if you're having an interaction with a cop, I can't come busting my way in and be like, Arun's my friend, stop it. You can't do that, okay? So you need to be a respectful distance, and that distance is going to change depending on the size of the scene, right? If you've got 2 cops who are holding on to, let's say, a guy who's just biking past and they're on the sidewalk, certainly if you're across the street on the other sidewalk, you're going to be fine. You're not obstructing anything. Ideally, I think those police should generally respect if you're 8-10 feet away on the sidewalk, you're nowhere near interfering with their police process, you're not part of the crime scene, as it were, you're good.
I would also say 8 feet is where you can still be getting good audio. So I'm glad to hear you say that. I think that especially, and I would say it's tempting in these situations, I think, to be talking a lot, and I think it's okay to be talking when you need to be, and be talking to the police, letting them know you're filming them, letting them know you're there. No one wants to be surprised by a guy with a camera.
Right.
But the more quiet you are, the more audio we can hear, and audio is more than half of what's going on.
Without a doubt. And I also mentioned that obstruction, interfering with police doing their duties, usually physical, right? It's you usually think of that as I'm in the way somehow. But there are situations where people have been charged with obstruction just for using their words, and it's usually when you are repeatedly making a connection with an individual who's part of that arrest. It might be a cop, right? So if you're yelling repeatedly, I hate cops, get away from that guy, you have no right to arrest him, and the police officer literally can't hear to do their job, that might be valid obstruction. Similarly, if you're yelling at the person who is a suspect in some way, and saying, lie to the cops, don't tell them your name, things like that, there have been situations where people have been charged with obstruction for that as well. So not only is being quiet good for getting better audio from a videography perspective, it's less likely to get you in hot water for obstruction. Not that you don't have a right to speak. I want to be clear. I'm an attorney, and the ACLU will get your back if you do say something and the cops don't like it. But if we're trying to...
Let's put that number underneath right now.
If you're trying to de-escalate a situation and do the best to capture something while avoiding arrest, not screaming at people involved in a police encounter is a great first step.
George Valdez has a great question, which is, can the filming itself be considered interfering with the investigation? Can police use that as an excuse to stop the filming or take your phone?
The answer, I'm mostly going to be a mushy lawyer robot and say, well, it really depends, but not for that one. The
You're not
answer
charging
is
us by the
no, right. I still talk too much, but it's not for the money. But this one is actually a black and white answer. A police officer cannot cite the fact of recording as interference. It's just not possible. And that's the kind of thing that the ACLU has sued and won over. And there's another part of that question too, right? Can they confiscate? That's a that's another $1 million question. The Fourth Amendment protects your right to be free of unlawful searches and seizures by the police, by the government. And we have repeatedly fought and won the right for police not to search through your cell phone or its camera, even if you're arrested. So not only can police not confiscate your camera, they can't look at your pictures, they can't demand that you let them look at your pictures, but we actually believe that they can't do any of that without a warrant. So unless you yourself have been arrested, the cops just can't go there. That's part of your protected First and Fourth Amendment rights.
I have a follow-up from that weird, squishy kind of quasi-law that we all, so you know, that the rest of us live in that you don't. I heard that if you have the fingerprint thing activated on your iPhone, that means the cops can make you open it up. But if you have a password, say, you know, 4-digit number, that they can't do that. Is that a true distinction?
Not really, but it's still a good idea not to do the fingerprint. And the reason is, so our belief is
news you can use.
Yeah, this is. And we have fought for this right. Cops need a warrant if they're going to confiscate your stuff, with only the tiniest, most lawyerly exception ever, which is if they literally believe that you've captured evidence of something relevant to a criminal investigation and think you're about to delete it, they can temporarily hold it, but they can't arrest you, they can't look at your pictures, they can't delete it, anything without a warrant. So it's a pretty strong warrant requirement. So whether or not I had a password or whether I had a thumbprint, it wouldn't matter, because we'd say either would violate the law. That being said, as we talked about, Arun, sometimes the law and the Constitution isn't perfectly followed in the streets, right? So I'm being the world's most paranoid person here. Most law, you know, I don't think police are running around violating this many constitutional rights on the regular, okay? But theoretically, your thumb could be pushed here and activate your phone, right? If you don't have a thumbprint enacted, nobody can do that. It's only in your head. So if you're really paranoid, you want to be super safe, only use the passcode option and have it set so the second you turn off your phone, it requires that password, so that if you are taping something or you're streaming a video and you do get in a situation with police where you're worried that someone will ask to confiscate or see that video, immediately turn your phone off so that it requires the password, and then no one will have access to your data. So the constitutional questions are academic, which is always a good place to be.
That is true.
Yeah.
We have another good question coming in, which is from Ali Boelks, and she wants to know, is there a good instant upload app? She's talking about Periscope, Facebook. I have, before you get into the legalities of it, which I think are interesting, I think that anything that you use should hopefully have the ability to shoot landscape again, so you can get the maximum amount of video density while you're shooting that you can. But I think there's other good reasons to use or not use certain apps. I mean, we recently had, you know, social media platforms like Facebook, for instance, are a third party. They are not part of the law. How does that affect the chain of custody between your video and the world?
Well, you're giving it to a stranger, right? And that stranger's a corporation who, you know, has a bottom line. I shouldn't have said who. Corporations are not people.
That's
folks.
right. Yeah.
But basically, you are risking something, right? Because you're putting trust in a third party to hold on to your video. And so you really want to think about this. If you know you're going into a situation where you're going to be a citizen journalist, you're going to use your phone to collect something that's important to you, you want to be armed with the knowledge of what different apps offer to you. So Periscope, which, for example, we saw basically take over the streets in Baltimore after the killing of Freddie Gray, is really valuable because you're immediately live streaming, right? So people can log on to Periscope and actually follow live streams like it's the news.
Ferguson was interesting too. There wasn't a lot of journalism on the ground.
Absolutely. The ACLU has actually developed its own app for situations like this. It's called Mobile Justice. It's available in 17 states and the District of Columbia. If you go on our website, you can just Google ACLU Mobile Justice and it will tell you which states that has it. But Mobile Justice automatically streams offsite to the ACLU in real time. So let's say I'm taking a video, landscape per Arun, and all of a sudden somebody hits my phone out of my hands and it breaks. Or, God forbid, police wrongly and unlawfully confiscate my phone. Everything until that second that I've videotaped has already been uploaded to a secure server offsite that the ACLU manages. And so in that way, if you are concerned that you're going to be in a high stress situation where somebody might terminate your video feed, all of that is captured and no one has the ability to delete it after the fact. So different apps are great for that, and a lot of people, of course, have been using services offered through Twitter or Facebook, and the important thing to remember is these are private companies that sometimes play very nice with the police. So if you want to know, hey, if I take a video that the cops want to see, will they turn it over? Will they shut down my account? You might be surprised to find out that Facebook, for example, has no policies dealing with when the police ask that someone's account be shut down, right? We want this live video to terminate. This is something that happened recently to a woman named Corinne Gaines, who was having a standoff with the police. She was posting video on Facebook. Police contacted Facebook and said, look, this is a hostage situation. We need you to shut this feed down. And Facebook did. And you know what? Who knows if that was the right call? What I do know is they didn't have a policy in place to describe what would happen in that situation. And as someone who is using their products, you should be an informed customer. Read their terms and conditions, read their community standards, find out when can they turn your speech over to law enforcement? When can they shut it down? And if you don't understand the answers, best to use an app like Mobile Justice, where you're not worried about a corporation interfering with your ability to get your voice out.
And I would say on Mobile Justice, the recording mechanism is very simple. It says things like, hit here to record, and you're already recording it, so it's been fabulous that way. But people are still probably rightly nervous. So, you have made absolutely and abundantly clear, to my satisfaction, to most people out there, that you have the right to film in public places, whether that's police operations, the airport, like all of these things, we have the right. But what do you actually do when a cop says, hey, you can't film that? And you're like, but I can. And they're like, but no, you can't.
But no, you can't.
And they're an authority figure and you're not.
Without a doubt. And there are limits to being a lawyer and quoting the Constitution all the time, right? At some point, if I were interacting with a police officer and felt that my First Amendment rights were being infringed, I would probably stop citing the Constitution and politely say, yes, sir, right? And that's this disconnect between our rights and the law. We're here because we want you to know your rights. We want you to enforce them whenever you feel comfortable doing that. But whenever you're interacting with the police, there is a power imbalance there for anyone. And so being polite, never lying, do not lie to the police. You can be accidentally engaged in a misdemeanor if you do that.
You went from doing nothing wrong to doing something wrong.
Exactly. Yeah. If you are asked to identify yourself, in many states they have rules that you are required to identify yourself truthfully when asked by a police. By the way, you do not have to provide ID. There's no requirement of carrying a national ID card around, but you may be in these situations where you're going to have to make a decision. Do I step back? Do I put my phone away? Do I lie about having a camera? And I think there are two things one can do. The first is keep in mind to be calm as you can be, and firm and polite. And actually, people have pretty good luck when they politely and firmly, at least once, say something like, I am not interfering with your operation. I am here recording this event, as is my protected constitutional right, and I'd like to ask you if I'm free to go, right? And free to go is it's a legal term, it's in English, but what it means is, am I under arrest? And the police have to have some suspicion that you're involved in a criminal act in order to be under arrest. So sometimes that language will just trigger in a cop's mind a realization that I'm on videotape, somebody's gonna see this, right, who I work for, I better behave. And when you have those little, again, polite but firm, I have a constitutional right, am I free to go? They can sometimes help in just triggering a polite response from a police officer where your rights will be respected. Now, even saying all that, we don't live in a perfect world. We know that there has been widespread retaliation against people who have videotaped police encounters. Just one example from here in New York is the gentleman who videotaped the arrest of Eric Garner, became a target of immense police interest and activity, and there's no way that was a coincidence. No,
that's on everyone's minds while we're having this conversation, is that incident specifically.
So I don't want to pretend everything's going to be fine. I mean, the one thing that's really important is to understand if you're voluntarily entering a situation where there may be heightened interactions between law enforcement and the crowd, to decide in advance, how much am I willing to go to the mat? Do I think of this as an act of civil disobedience? Am I willing to press for my rights up until they put me in the back of a squad car, right? In which case, maybe you want the number of attorney. Maybe you want to make sure your password immediately deletes a video, right? Maybe you want to make sure you're using one of these off-site streamings. That's right. You can do things like, how quickly can I get my phone app out and record, right? How is my muscle memory? How quickly can I shut it down? How quickly can I text a friend, right? Have a buddy and let them know, if you don't check in by 4, go check the local precinct, right? So if you're going in with the belief that, hey, I have these rights. The ACLU's fought for these rights. I believe in the First Amendment. I'm not going to be told anything that isn't my right. I'm going to enforce my rights. You have every right to do that, but you should understand it's not a perfect world. There may be members of law enforcement who don't respect those rights, and go into that situation vowing to remain calm, remain on the right side of the line, be polite, say those trigger words. For other folks, they just may not be in a position where they have the luxury to get arrested. And in that situation,
it's very real for some people.
It's very
not
real.
I can do that to.
You record, I think, up until the moment that you feel like you are in danger of being arrested. You make sure you're doing that at as far a distance as you can to have everything on tape. If indeed you have one of these incidents where you believe your rights were not respected, you should report it to COPWATCH. You should report it to the ACLU. You should file a complaint with your local civilian review board. So just because you decide to err on the side of the deferential and the polite when you believe you're right, step away or I'll arrest you, when you have every right to be making that video, there are still things you can do after the fact to make sure that people in charge hear about those stories, so that when people do say, I experienced retaliation for videotaping, they know you're not being hysterical, right? So to help community activists at COPWATCH, at ACLU, collect those stories and make sure that there are real policies in place to make sure that when individual law enforcement officers don't respect those rights, there are consequences for doing so.
Speaking of collecting these stories, we had a question that I think we'll both have different answers for. Which is just a technical question from Joseph Kahn, which is, if he uses mobile justice in Hawaii, will it be saved by the California ACLU? My impression is that there are separate apps for the different states based on the laws and the things of that state. And so the answer is, with mobile justice, that would not work
That's
in
right.
multiple states.
That's right. And unfortunately, we don't have it in Hawaii yet, but we do have it in California, so it's available to residents of Cali, but that's it.
What are the differences in the state? Are there any specific and outliers that we should mention to our nationwide audience?
The answer now is no. There are a lot of differences among the states in terms of rules that prohibit two-party recording. So basically, if right now I was secretly recording you, right here in New York,
and that has to do with audio.
Audio
Function,
you.
right?
So we're not talking about video. States have what are called wiretapping laws, and they basically make it illegal for you to secretly tape record, audio record a conversation. And so there are about 12 states that have those laws, and in those laws, activists were getting arrested for surveilling and wiretapping the police when they just openly recorded, a police encounter. We have now worked to establish the First Amendment right to record the police engaged in their public duties now applies even in those two-party consent states. So at this point, I think the First Amendment right to record the police engaged in their public duties, audio and video, is established. And it doesn't really matter what state you're in. The only kind of remaining question on that is whether or not you have to be doing it openly. That is, can you let's say the cops pull you over in your car and you've got your cell phone and you do your practice thing and you quickly do it and you put it in your passenger seat. That's actually being fought over in the courts right now. We actually have cases involving that. So it's not a clearly established right to secretly record the cops.
As a filmmaker, I would say that, and even in past sort of tense situations where you've gone overseas and stuff, pretending not to film when you're filming fills me with anxiety.
Yes.
I think it should fill all of you with anxiety. It gets us into all kinds of areas. I think sometimes you may think it's the right thing to do, and you may even be right. In general, it gives me pause when you say now I'm filming this clandestinely, because I just know it's that act of surprise that can escalate situations so fast. I had a certain understanding situation, now it's been changed radically.
And there's it's more likely to escalate a situation. And that's really a lot of what we're talking about is, how do you know your rights and ideally not have a situation escalate on you, right? And so, although, look, the ACLU has actually and probably would fight for your rights if you surreptitiously recorded the cops, probably the best practice if you're looking to keep that situation from escalating and make sure you don't get arrested is to politely say at the beginning of an interaction where someone is close enough to be capturing their voice and their audio, please note I am recording this interaction, I have the right to do.
And it's a perfectly polite way to behave. I think it's great.
Yeah.
Here's a great question from Michelle Webb. What are the places time and places that it is not legal to film? Where should you be let's say there was a protest outside a prison. I'm just randomly coming up with scenarios.
Sure.
What are the weird things we're not thinking about?
So First Amendment rights are at their most robust in places that the law calls public forum spaces, and that's just a fancy term for basically sidewalks, streets, and public parks. So anywhere that people congregate, right? Protest areas where, as long as you're lawfully on public property, you've got every right to speak, to listen, to videotape, to audio record. You got it. Your First Amendment rights are in good shape in those places. We also have fought for the right to videotape what the government is doing engaged in their public places when you're in a publicly accessible area of, say, a public building. So let's say you're in a rotunda of a government administration building. You have every right to capture stuff that's in public view. That's actually even true in airports. TSA generally asks people not to capture the actual security apparatus.
Right? Yeah.
And we pass that request along, although it's not clear they have a right to, restrain you from doing so. In part, just think of it from a practicality point of view. Like, if the terrorists are going to win because somebody takes a picture of a belt that everyone going through LaGuardia can see, like, our nation is in deep trouble. So It's like, what secret ball are we hiding? I don't totally get it. But as a general rule, if you're allowed to be there, if the general public's allowed to be there, you can videotape government going on. Where you don't have the right to videotape would be on private property. Now, you may have a right to videotape. Let's say you're in your favorite store and your friend, video chats you. Can you pick it up and, start talking and capture people in the background? They're probably not going to throw you out. But the rule is that private property owners can set the rules for coming on their property. Right. So you could have a store that says, no cell phones allowed in here, right? They could kick you out if you take out your cell phone. They're allowed to do that if they're a private property
owner. As long as they're applying that to everyone, yeah.
That's right. And the government, we treat the government more like a private property owner when it's in areas of public buildings that are not as publicly accessible, where they're actually doing their jobs rather than just hosting the public, right? So you can't walk into a judge's chambers behind a court and start videotaping. You can't, walk into a bureaucrat's office and hold a vigil, right? And that makes sense. So your First Amendment rights are their most robust, first, when you're outside in one of these traditional areas, park, sidewalks, you name it. Secondly, when you're kind of in areas of the government's property where the general public is invited. And there is no exception for having federal buildings in the background. Again, that was a ACLU case, our New York affiliate, had a situation where people were protesting outside a government administration building. And they said, no, you can't get shots of the outside of this building, very sensitive. And we went to court. And not only did we win the right to videotape the back of that building, but the Department of Homeland Security actually had to put out guidance to every DHS officer saying,
this is how it is.
This is how it is. And capturing the outside of a public building in no way reduces your First Amendment rights to record. So go ahead and have your press conference outside of Sing Sing or what have you. If it's in the background and you can see it with the naked eye from a place you're allowed to be, you have the First Amendment right to record it.
It's funny, a couple months after I left the White House, I was filming for the State Department a bunch of things around town, and I ended up being outside the White House at night. And I had worked there for so long that I was so interested in the place that I sort of thought of a new angle to shoot it from. I got real excited about it. So for about an hour and a half in the dark outside the White House, I was futzing around with cameras. Secret Service that came out, and they're like, hey, I know you used to even work here last week, but
right.
And we're not going to ask you to look at your stuff, and we're not here to bother you, but you're being weird, and just it would help us to know that just what you're doing.
Yeah,
I was like, it's good to know that.
Actually,
it was a
pretty
great interaction.
interaction.
It was a great
It's
interaction.
Really good.
Yeah.
It's funny because part of this, I got a lot of complaints about that right in the context of train enthusiasts. So generally retired guys who would hang out at Amtrak stations and film the newest models of trains. And they ended up getting a lot of run-ins with DHS and other entities.
Because they're filming infrastructure.
Yeah,
what
and
they're
you kept
there to do.
having to call and be if it's sensitive, you put it behind a wall, right? If you've got it out on the tracks for everybody to see, you can take a picture, and that's the right.
We've got two good questions coming in here that I'm going to put to you in order here. First is from Nima, and she wants to know, well, is it okay to photograph or film something located on private property if, and she makes a distinction, the event is newsworthy?
Right. Well, the general answer is no, if you mean, do you have an extra right to go on that private property? And the answer is no. Being a journalist doesn't give you extra First Amendment rights. That's
so
just
the pipeline, is that on private property, for instance, in North Dakota
the
where everyone's
pipeline
going?
itself, my understanding is that the majority of the pipeline, the actual infrastructure, is on private property. Now, of course, journalists can stand on public property and tape anything over the side of the line, right? You can capture things as long as you're physically standing on public property.
Yeah.
That's right. You can. There's no kind of magical wall past which you can't videotape. Fortunately, that's not how our world works, right? So certainly, if the events on private property are visible to the naked eye, yes. But being a journalist does not give you a right to violate trespass laws because you know something interesting is going on in there.
Even if you know, 100%.
That's right. Even if you know.
The alien autopsy is happening over that
That's
hill ridge.
right. And a journalist might decide, if I get into Area 51, I got the scoop of the century. But that journalist is deciding to commit an unlawful act and presumably would bear the consequences of doing that.
Is a city council meeting Area 51? Someone else, Zach, was asking. So you're inside a closed government thing, but it's open to the public. I think he's trying to find a squishy area for us.
Yeah, I mean, it's a squishy area. This is one that actually comes up a lot. It is our position that it is irrational to ban people from recording at city council meetings. In fact, they're almost always recorded by the government entity, and maybe they're just jealous because they get to charge you 10 cents a page if you ask for the record or something, right, later on. But actually, this is something that comes up a lot, and courts haven't been totally universal on this right. So this is a mushy one where I would say, if you're having any kind of interaction where your city council or local government has banned photography writ large, that's the kind of thing to contact your local ACLU about, because it's our position that people have that right, but I can't say that every court has agreed with us on that.
Right, but that's the hope and the joy and the movement.
That's right. We're getting there.
So what all do you, what are you doing now for folks who get themselves in trouble? What are the resources the ACLU has for someone who gets charged with a felony because they were filming an incident and they have run afoul of any of the 9 or 10 things that we've outlined for them?
So, the ACLU, as a general matter, we're a nonprofit that protects rights, and we try and make sure that our constitutional rights stay robust even as technology changes. So we see our goal as making sure traditional First Amendment rights are respected even in a digital age, right? And moving the law where we need to, like fighting these two-party recording statutes in certain states to make sure that they still give you the right to record police. So we see our job as going out and making new law, right? Establishing that First Amendment right, making sure that that's what the rule of the law is. What we don't generally do is criminal defense. So once we've established that right, we don't tend to take on individual representation in cases. That's more the job of the defense bar, and then we make sure that they have all the information they need. So when there's a new question, so one we already talked about today, can you secretly record the police, right? Can you secretly have a camera in your dashboard, etc.?
Or your glasses. I mean, we're getting into the technology meets law.
Oh, you think you're not on camera right now?
Well,
I'm not the only
That's
one.
Why I actually asked.
So the ACLU actually is in court litigating that question, right? Defending someone who's arrested because he didn't disclose that his dash cam was on when he was pulled over for a traffic stop. So every ACLU affiliate has an intake form. If you believe your rights were violated, you can file an intake request. But just to give people a sense, we tend to take on cases where we think we can help the most people. And that's usually bringing this case in a new state that hasn't affirmed that you have every First Amendment right to videotape the cops, or bringing a case like this one where there are new hard questions. Once we've established that right, then we kind of hand off that work to the defense bar, and if you are wrongly arrested, make sure that they can get you off on those charges.
It's like a pyramid scheme of justice.
Yes.
I have a question, a technical question coming in, and I think you can weigh in, but I think they might want me to answer.
Please.
Which is, oftentimes you are in night situations, there's sirens, there's bright lights. How should you compensate for bright lights? Is there an attachment or a program or a filter? And my answer to that is twofold, but pretty simple. One is try to have the lights at your back. That way they are illuminating the subject in front of you rather than, flaring your camera. But failing that, just don't worry about it and do your thing, because you start adding in filters, you start adding in these extra things. All they're actually doing is destroying information. They're not making your image any better. They're making it look better by taking away information more often than not, and that's something we can deal with later. I know in the movies we never want to fix it in post. This is like, other people who work with me right now are like, I can't believe you'd even suggest this, but we'll fix this in post. Just get the stuff, be safe, do a good job. We value you. Okay, we have a question. Another question about recording in airports. what areas of the airport is okay and what areas of the airport are not okay? Someone was unclear about that.
Most of the airport is fair game, right? So anywhere that you're in these public areas or, at the gates, anywhere that you think of as TSA has informed the public that they do not want people directly taking pictures of the security apparatus.
So yeah, we mentioned that before.
Right.
So is that literally the X-ray machine? They don't want pictures of like the keys.
And they've also said similar to the security apparatus, that is like the details of the scanner, right, that you've just gone through. In addition to that, they don't want close-up shots of the individual agents who are running those security lines.
Oh, okay.
So those are the two requests that have come from TSA. And again, that's factual, not legal information. I think there's a real question about whether or not they could actually arrest you. But in the vein of de-escalating situations and keeping yourself safe, you should know that the highest risk for you in airports is if you're taking up-close pictures of security apparatus or the individual TSA officers running that security apparatus, up-close pictures of the belt, the actual scanner, the thing you stand up and do this in.
Yeah, whatever that's called.
I used to know because I boycotted it for a while until they changed the tech and we weren't naked behind the images. But I really should know.
Now we're all blobs.
But the backscatter machines. So any of those you want to avoid, close-up photographs if you're looking not to attract attention.
Okay, we have two very smart questions coming in about post-production, about editing. Okay, so let's say you have this footage of an incident.
Yeah.
What are your rights when it comes to editing it? Which is a question from Tran, but then Caleb follows up with matters of libel. Say a cop is behaving lawfully, but it's, on YouTube it looks like they're corrupt. If you edited it that way, what's going on here?
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of a bigger question than just videotaping, right? That's a question about editorial wisdom and style. The First Amendment generally protects you when you speak truthfully about important stuff. And if you share a video, you could never, you could if some crazy person wanted to take you to court for libel, sure, but you would not be found guilty of libel or slander, right? If you're just sharing something that is a literal, truthful image of something you've taken. Any editing choice can, of course, convey what the intent of the editor is.
Absolutely.
And so this is not unique to videography, right? It also is anytime you're editing a news article or you're editing a piece about anyone, you want to operate in good faith. And if you are selectively editing a video, you need to understand we're at a moment in time where I think police feel really under the gun, right? The degree of public surveillance has increased the stress of many police officers' jobs. And they may be very sensitive to the idea that a video is misrepresentative or paints them in a bad light. So certainly there are situations I've heard about where after being captured on camera, police have brought libel charges against people for editing videos. The safest thing to do is to provide an unedited video. And if you're editing, you want to use the kind of human values of truth and good sense. If you're cutting out something in a way that makes it look one-sided, you're going to have to own that editorial choice. And if it makes it look like something happened that didn't happen, or the vibe of the interaction was very different, you have to understand that person's reputation may be at stake, whoever you filmed, and you want to take that seriously, I think, not just as a matter of constitutional rights, but as a matter of journalistic ethics, right?
As someone who's trying to tell these stories, let's
right.
actually tell these stories,
That's
not whatever's dancing through our brain.
Right,
So.
and what a weird thing for all of us to have to think about. You started our talk by saying, we have all these videos because everybody's walking around. It really means we all have the opportunity to be citizen journalists. And that's a fabulous and wonderful opportunity that has enabled us to have, I think, richer and more truthful public conversations about American policy.
We're having a real conversation this year.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But it also means that if you want to voluntarily put yourself in those shoes, you might want to think about the duties of being a citizen journalist. And part of that duty, I think, is to be truthful. If you are sharing information with the purpose of informing a public conversation, don't put one-sided crap out there. Put out truthful information that allows us to have that conversation. And in the long run, that's going to be best for whatever movement you're part of. And it's going to keep you on the side of the line so you don't end up in court.
All right, I'm endorsing that as a political communicator, not just as a videographer concerned about police violence. That is absolutely authentic. Being authentic to a real message is so important. This is from our colleagues at the ACLU of Maine. The ACLU of Maine has brought a lawsuit against the Portland Police Department over the right to record. Settlement included an agreement that the department will do more officer training on the right to record. How can we get other departments to sign on to this? Are you seeing this happen more and more, or less and less as we're getting this glut of video material?
You know, I think this is such a political question, and I'm always about to get myself in hot water, right? Because I don't mean to demonize anyone on any side of this conversation. I think there has been a difference in how individual officers and how police unions, frankly, respond to the right to record. We at the ACLU have, with caution and nuance, supported the increased use of body cameras on cops, for example, right? So we, not just citizen bystanders, but we actually have police serving as witnesses to their own behavior as well. And in departments where there are more videos resulting from police encounters, use of force complaints in those communities go down significantly. Now, that's not everything, right? The ability to record, whether yourself as a citizen or on a body camera, is, I think, a necessary part of reform. It's not sufficient. It's not what we need to change policing culture. It's not everything. It's not, you know, an easy fix like that. But it's definitely a necessary part of any meaningful police reform, is the ability to see and document this kind of wrongdoing. And we need police departments to understand that when there are opportunities for the public to feel like they're heard, to issue complaints, to have accountability in the form of recording, their costs go down, their lawsuits go down, their use of force complaints go down. And that's a culture change that's been very hard because, of course, like all unions, police unions' job is to take kind of an extreme position. And so I think we're in a moment in time where policing culture is still responding, frankly, to the increased use of surveillance while they're doing their jobs, right? And we think it's good surveillance, but it's surveillance. And I think it does take a little empathy on both sides of this equation. I think I do my desk job happily, right? I have window cleaners who see me once every 2 years through my office, but otherwise people aren't standing around doing this at me while I'm working. And police, you know, they have to do that now. And that's important because our values as an open democracy mandate that we, the public, get to see them engaged in their duties. But let's not kid ourselves and pretend that's easy, right? And so having a bunch of people watching you on tape every second that you're doing your job, there is going to be adrenaline. There's going to be just a palpable sense that you're being surveilled, and cops are human, right? So that's how they're feeling when this is happening, which is why I think being polite, being firm about your rights, reminding them that this is a professional interaction between a cop and a citizen, that's a huge part of enabling officers to accept that this is the new culture we expect them to practice in. And the more and more that becomes normalized, ideally it trickles up to the unions. And then we, I think, also simultaneously have to work with the brass and get them to understand and internalize this is good for policing, right? It's not just good for our democracy or good for individual citizen journalists. It reduces complaints, it reduces force, and overall, if we're all having the same conversation, then at least we're having the same, you know, there's a baseline for how do we achieve reform. So the ACLU of Maine folks are awesome and brilliant, and they know this is ridiculously hard, but they're doing an amazing job because they're using lawsuits to make sure that there's an advocacy upshot, right? They're not just filing a one-off lawsuit, but when they win, they're saying, and now you've got to train people, you got to change this culture. And so that's what ACLU affiliates are doing all across the country. That's what we're trying to do at National is, yeah, we win these things in the courts, but now we have to make sure they trickle down so that your interactions on the street do reflect the highfalutin constitutional rights we're talking about today.
Totally. Lisa Judy got a little techie on us, and she wants to know about drone filming. All the things we're talking about now applicable to drones. And I will say, I know the little bit I know about this is here. Oh no, we're in New York City, but in Washington D.C., where I live, we owned and used a photographic drone, and then one day the laws changed about it, and the drone knew. So like over our office, we used to fly, and all of a sudden it wouldn't fly. It was like, I won't fly. And we're like, why? It's against the law.
That's right.
We don't actually talk to our drone like in that kind of voice, but you know, we would.
I would like the idea. Does it have a name, the drone? Droney?
It's the drone.
Okay, the drone. So faceless. So no, all bets are off if we're talking drone photography, because drone photography, unlike other photography, is actually governed by the FAA, which is the Federal Aviation Administration, and they take care of things that happen in the sky. And you know, we have been really forceful in arguing before federal policymakers that there have to be different rules for commercial drone operators and people who are citizen journalists. And we believe the news media should be treated more like citizen journalists, even if they sometimes profit from that footage. Right now we're losing that battle, but it's still all happening at the FAA. And so, you can come to ACLU to get more information about our filings with the FAA on behalf of citizen journalists. But basically, if you are flying a drone and you are doing it in part to gather news footage, you have to check the rules both in your locality and at the FAA, because this is a very quickly developing area of law. That being said, the ACLU is really interested in protecting it, in part because it's one of the only ways we can see large-scale environmental catastrophes.
Yes, the things in West Virginia have been spectacular.
Absolutely, and runoff from farms and all kinds of environmental hazards that are just tough to get horizontally, right? You really need to see the scale from the air. So it really is an incredibly valuable market for information that we all have a right to see, I think, as the citizenry. But you're also flying in the airspace, so you got new federal agencies that care about what you're doing. So generally, if you're going to be using drones repeatedly, that's a very niche area of photojournalism, and I recommend that you check out the ACLU's writing about our petitions.
And I agree with your characterization of where it's useful, because it is something where it's big, big photos, video are needed. Drones are very noisy little critters. So the two things I would say is, one, you're never going to get a lot of good sound when you have a drone going, and two, you're going to freak people out if they're... So if you actually came down in over a police encounter with a drone, it would sound like you were attacking it with like a million little buzzing insects. Like it is a scary, horrible noise.
No doubt. And actually there was a really interesting incident in Connecticut where a guy was trying to monitor a police scene. I think it was a car crash scene. I hope I'm right about that. But it was some kind of, not pleasant, very gruesome scene outside, and had a drone over the event trying to capture footage. And one of the cops said, and I don't think, this isn't an insane thing to say, if something happened to that drone, it would fall right into the middle of our police investigation. So there are a lot of unanswered questions. That's right. And it's not interfering now, but what if your batteries die, right? So I'm just saying drones are super complicated if you're routinely using drones. Educate yourself very specifically on drone-specific rules, because everything we're talking about won't directly translate.
Yeah, no one's saying you can't, but I think we're all saying avoid police encounters with drones. I think we are. I think we're on the same page there.
And actually, when you mentioned something I think is worth saying, is you mentioned how you're going to freak people out.
Yeah.
We've been talking now for half an hour about your right to film people, right? And we're thinking about this as a positive value, which it is. I'm a free speech attorney. It's great.
Totally.
But one thing we haven't talked about yet is how it feels to yourself to be recorded. And one thing that I think is just important to realize is, in order for us to have First Amendment rights, we need to recognize that sometimes they can be aimed at us, right? What's good for the goose is good for the gander. You don't only get First Amendment rights if you're a nice person. Everybody gets them. So if you're at a protest and let's say people who hate what you believe in are walking down the line capturing everybody's face on their video camera, it's really uncomfortable. Viscerally, I think most people feel like something wrong is happening to me, but those people have just as much of a right to videotape in public as you do. And I think drones...
Does that account for, for instance, clinic protests? If they were to photograph women going in and out, folks doing that?
Yes, as a general matter, yeah. Yep. Unless they are actually harassing someone, right, repeatedly following them, or the subject of an order.
It's a good example of free speech. We don't necessarily everyone who is a fan of the ACLU likes so I think it's...
Absolutely, and that's tough for us. We're both a reproductive rights and a free speech organization, right? So getting that balance right, we want women to have access to care to which they're constitutionally entitled, but we can't make a total zone of silence around. That's not very democratic, right? It's not consistent with the First Amendment. So it's just drones, I think, have made that experience more emotional for people. I think sometimes if you're somewhere where you think you're alone and you see a drone, I don't know if this has happened to folks yet. It happened to me once at a bar. It was a very empty bar outside, and I saw it and I had this very visceral reaction, like, oh my God, I'm being watched. And it's uncomfortable, but it's necessary if we're going to have the right to take pictures in public spaces. So one thing you can remember is, don't be a jerk. Remember that other people that you're videotaping are human, and think about how you would feel if you were on the receiving end of that video. And ideally capture people in the way you'd want to be captured, which is politely let people know they're on film, and be respectful, and don't escalate or get aggressive or get right into somebody's face. These are basic human traits that can help you not only be like a good human, but avoid arrest and avoid escalating
and
situations.
Be a better documentary filmmaker. You never got anything good by shoving a camera on someone's face. I'll tell you that right now. We are sort of getting to the end, but a really important issue that Dean brought up is sort of the different, the racial component to who you are at the event, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So a lot of people have more privilege to be in a position where they can maybe risk arrest, where they can maybe... how do you think folks should gauge that? Let's say you are black and you feel like you may get brought into the situation in a very, very negative way, a la Eric Gardner. Are there just guidelines? I know this is not necessarily a legal question, but you're in this issue and you see it. So can you talk a little bit to that?
Right. I mean, a little bit. I'm a white lady, so I'm hesitant to put my, I'm not a black person who has to kind of grapple with that reality. But I do think. I
mean, have you seen the people being treated differently or filming?
Yes, we know that to be the case. One thing that struck me as really incredible is the right to film the police and kind of the almost the forerunner to COPWATCH is a group of white men who are, I would say, trend libertarian, who really object to border checkpoints that aren't on the physical border. So the U.S. government has expanded the border to basically being 200 miles in from the border, which is a swath of our country that basically is a third of the population. Border has ceased to have any meaning at that point. But these guys who politically oppose the spread of the federal government's power would drive through checkpoints repeatedly and just film themselves politely declining to a search, right? Politely declining to answer any questions. I politely decline to tell you my name. I politely decline to tell you where I'm going. And, I don't know that this was at all part of their thinking, but in an interesting way, these white guys who are more conservative leaning, I think, are actually using their white privilege to establish and demonstrate that right by going over and over it within a position where they're not particularly endangered. And so we all have to live in our own skins. And I would never tell someone of any race, even my own, how that, I think, should play out their perceptions. But statistically, we know people of color have more negative interactions with police. I know from talking to a lot of cops in my line of work that this is emotional for them, that being recorded feels like an invasion, even if ultimately our democracy demands that they tolerate it, right, in their role as a public steward of our liberties. So I think, understand that these can be stressful situations, even if you don't intend them to. Have a backup plan. If you're a person of color and believe that you might be a particular target, do those things we talked about before. Assess your risk tolerance in advance. Decide when you're going to cave if you believe somebody is making an unjust request of you. Do you have a friend who's backup, right? Maybe you stand 20 feet apart and the bolder one is up front and the backup videotapes everything that goes down in case that person is given an unjust command. So we do live in a world where race matters. And I think when people go out there and think about interacting with the police, all of these ground rules apply. But if you're a person of color and you have a greater degree of concern that you're going to have a negative interaction, and I'm sorry to ask this of anyone because it's not fair, but plan for that negative interaction.
No, I know.
Figure out, what you're willing to do, what you're willing to put up with, and have a buddy system.
And I would say from a ACLU perspective, I am not a member of the organization. I do think this is one of the best ways you can be an ally of privilege, is to use your privilege to stand a little closer with the camera than maybe someone else of your peers could.
Yeah. And that's actually a great, that I should have said is, if you believe that you're in a privileged position, for example, I'm a white lady and I have a law degree, right? And I practice free speech law. If I see someone having an interaction with the police where I think the police are being aggressive or unfair, I can say something. And again, you want to do it in a way where you yourself are not going to be arrested for obstruction.
Or exacerbating situation.
Right? But of course, but if you can lend your voice to someone else who may not be as empowered or as privileged, that's a great way to be a progressive and, to fight for the cause where you have a different stake, and a different level of privilege. And we can all think about standing up in different ways for racial justice, whether or not we're people of color.
That is as much time as we're going to have now. This is obviously a conversation that is happening in America, that is happening in the rooms here at the ACLU, and that shouldn't stop right now. So I think we would encourage folks, if you have questions that aren't answered, to please keep writing them in, and they will be addressed by folks over here. And just appreciate y'all's attention so much.
Thanks for joining us.
Thanks.